The fourth time my wedding date was announced, our farmhouse smelled of wet wool, coffee, and the cinnamon bread my mother had baked before sunrise. I remember standing beside the long table with my hands folded so tightly that my fingernails pressed into my palms. 3 dates had already disappeared from our calendar. I had promised myself I would not ask why again. Then the minister unfolded the paper my mother had been smoothing all morning and began reading the names. Daniel's came first. Mine should have followed. Instead, he said my sister Anna's name. What frightened me was not the mistake, it was that no one corrected him. My name is Miriam, and this story comes from a fictional Amish household where family loyalty often mattered more than asking uncomfortable questions. If you value stories about the quiet decisions people make when duty and choice pull in opposite directions, you can subscribe to Miriam Amish Home. And before I explain why Anna's name was still attached to my wedding, tell me something simple. If your wedding had been postponed 3 times, would you still trust the 4th date without asking for a reason? I wish I had asked sooner. At 23, I thought patience proved maturity. I did not yet understand that sometimes patience only gives other people more time to decide for you. Daniel's family farmed the land beside ours, close enough that I could see the top of their barn from my bedroom window in winter. Our fathers had traded labor for years, sharing equipment, hay wagons, and favors that were never written down. Daniel and I had known each other since childhood, but our courtship began quietly when I was 22. Nothing about it felt forced to me. He was steady, soft-spoken, and careful around my parents. When he began visiting more regularly, my mother called the match a good fit for everyone. I heard warmth in that sentence. Looking back, I should have noticed that she said everyone, not me. Anna was 3 years older and had always been harder for my parents to predict. She asked questions I swallowed. She could finish a day's work without complaint, then refuse something simply because she believed it was wrong for her. By the time Daniel began courting me, Anna was living with relatives several miles away and helping with their small store. We were not estranged, but we were no longer close. Years earlier, I had heard an aunt say Anna had made things difficult for our family. Nobody explained what she meant, and I never pressed. In our house, questions often felt heavier than answers. I learned to leave certain sentences alone. When Daniel and I agreed to marry, both families moved quickly. My mother brought out fabric, my father began discussing which relatives would need notice, and Daniel's mother sent over jars of preserved fruit as if a decision had been settled before I fully understood it. I was happy. That matters to me now. I was not being dragged toward a man I disliked. I believed I was choosing Daniel, and that belief made everything afterward harder to untangle. Whenever my parents mentioned how convenient the marriage would be, I took it as approval. I never considered that our wedding might be solving an older problem between the families, one that had started before Daniel ever looked at me differently. Our first wedding date was set for late autumn. 2 weeks before it, my father called me into the back room after supper. He did not sit down. He stood beside the small desk where he kept receipts and seed notes and told me Daniel's family needed more time. I asked what had happened. He said nothing serious, only that patience would protect both families from embarrassment. That word stayed with me. Embarrassment, not illness, not money, not weather. When I asked Daniel the next day, he gave nearly the same answer. He said postponing was wiser than creating trouble. Neither man could tell me what trouble they meant, and I was expected to accept that as reassurance. A few days later, I found my mother's household ledger open on the kitchen table. She used it for planting dates, purchases, births, visits, and anything she feared forgetting. Our wedding date had been written near the bottom of one page, then crossed out with 2 hard strokes. Beneath it was a new date. Beside that date were 2 initials, M and A. I knew what the M meant. I asked my mother about the A. She closed the ledger so quickly that the ribbon marker slipped onto the floor. Then she smiled and said Anna had once helped her organize family events. I wanted to believe her, mostly because the alternative had no shape yet. I told myself the first delay was ordinary. Families had problems, plans changed. Good daughters did not turn every inconvenience into an accusation. So when the new date was written on the calendar, I forced myself to feel grateful instead of suspicious. But something had shifted inside the house. My mother stopped discussing the wedding when Anna's name came up. My father became careful whenever Daniel's family visited, and Daniel, who had once spoken easily about the future, began answering simple questions as if each one had a hidden edge. I did not know what the initials meant. I only knew that my sister's name had entered my wedding before she had entered the room. Part 2. The second date was set for 6 weeks later, close enough that I could keep the same dress fabric folded in my chest. My mother resumed preparations, but the house no longer carried the easy excitement of the first time. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. My father checked the yard whenever Daniel's buggy approached, as though each visit required preparation. I told myself this was because everyone feared another delay. At supper one evening, my aunt mentioned that our families had finally settled the matter. My mother dropped her spoon against the bowl. I looked from one face to another and asked what matter she meant. Nobody answered me directly. Later that night, I asked my mother again while we folded towels near the stove. She said adults sometimes used old phrases for problems that no longer mattered. Then she changed the subject to flour, guests, and how much butter we would need. Her calmness bothered me more than anger would have. I began noticing how often practical work appeared whenever I asked about Anna. A drawer needed sorting, dough needed kneading, someone needed water carried. The work itself was real, but it also gave everyone somewhere to look besides my face. By then I understood that silence in our home was rarely empty. It usually belonged to somebody who already knew the answer. I decided Daniel was the one person who owed me a clear explanation. We met beside the lane after evening chores, far enough from both houses that nobody could hear us without trying. I asked whether he had ever courted Anna. He looked toward the fence instead of at me. Then he said our families had once talked about possibilities. I asked what that meant. He said nothing had happened between them and that Anna had chosen another direction. The answer was careful, almost polished, and I could feel him giving me the smallest version of the truth. I asked why he had never told me. He said he had not thought it mattered anymore. That answer changed something between us. Until then, I had feared a mistake in my mother's ledger. Now I knew Anna's initial belonged beside Daniel's name for a reason. I asked whether our parents had expected them to marry. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of the fence rail and said expectations were not the same as promises. I asked whether there had been a promise. He said no, too quickly. Then he added that families sometimes hope for things their children did not choose. I should have felt relieved by that sentence. Instead, I heard the word choose and wondered why everyone seemed so determined to keep me from making an informed one. For the first time, I considered postponing the wedding myself. I mentioned it to my father the next morning while we carried feed sacks into the shed. He stopped walking before I finished the sentence. He did not threaten me. That would have been easier to understand. He told me another postponement would embarrass Daniel's family, hurt ours, and make people wonder whether I was dependable. He spoke as if my hesitation had consequences for everyone except me. Then he softened and said he only wanted peace for both families. I believed he meant it. That was the difficulty. People can love you and still protect an arrangement that asks you to stay quiet. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Anna. Her handwriting was narrow and familiar, but the message inside was shorter than I expected. She asked whether I had chosen Daniel freely and whether I felt able to change my mind if I wanted to. Nothing else, no accusation, no explanation. I read it twice, then once more after supper. Because I was already suspicious, I interpreted her questions as jealousy. I wondered whether she regretted whatever had happened years earlier. I even felt angry that she had waited until my wedding plans were unstable to contact me. Instead of answering, I folded the letter into my sewing basket and decided silence was safer than inviting her into the confusion. The second date disappeared less than 2 weeks later. This time, Daniel's father came himself and said unresolved family business required more time. I asked what business. He answered that some matters were better handled by older people who understood their history. That sentence stayed with me because it excluded me from a decision about my own marriage. Daniel stood beside him and said very little. My father accepted the delay without argument. My mother looked relieved rather than surprised. I noticed all of it. The explanations were changing, but the reactions were not. By then, I no longer believed the postponements were separate accidents. They were connected to something everyone around me had already agreed not to explain. That evening, I opened a small school notebook and began writing down every explanation I had been given. First delay, Daniel's family needed time. Second delay, unresolved family business, Anna's initial beside mine. Daniel admitting our families had once discussed him and Anna, my aunt saying something had been settled, Anna asking whether I had chosen freely. Written together, the pieces looked different than they had inside separate conversations. I was not ready to accuse anyone, but I was finished trusting my memory to people who kept changing their words. On the next clean page, I wrote one question and underlined it twice. What happened between Anna and Daniel before anyone asked me to marry him? Part 3. The next morning, I waited until my mother went to the wash house before opening the ledger again. I had no permission to search it, and that troubled me, but not enough to stop. The first wedding date was still crossed out, the second written beneath it, and beside both sat the same two initials. M and A farther down the page, I noticed a faint pencil mark beside Daniel's family name, almost erased. It looked older than either wedding date. I traced the paper with one finger, trying to decide whether I was seeing evidence or simply forcing meaning onto ordinary notes. Then I heard my mother's steps outside and closed the book. She entered before I could move away from the table. Her eyes went first to the ledger, then to me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I asked why Anna's initial appeared beside both wedding dates. My mother said I was reading too much into household records. I asked whether Anna had ever been expected to marry Daniel. She picked up the ledger and held it against her chest. Then she said very quietly that some plans belonged to the past and should be left there. That was not an answer, but it was the first time she admitted there had been a plan. I asked who had made it. She told me to let my father explain. My father did not explain. He listened while I repeated the question, then told me I was turning old misunderstandings into present trouble. I asked whether the first postponement had anything to do with Anna. He said the delay had been necessary because Daniel's family needed time. I opened my notebook and read back the words he had used weeks earlier. He looked at the page and his expression changed. Until then, I think everyone assumed I would keep each conversation separate. Writing them down made that harder. He asked why I was keeping records about my own family. I said because nobody in my family would give me the same explanation twice. That afternoon, Daniel came to help repair a gate damaged by a loose horse. I waited until my father walked toward the barn before approaching him. I showed him the notebook, but not the ledger. I asked whether he knew why our first date had been canceled. He said his father had asked for more time and that he had accepted it. I asked whether the request involved Anna. Daniel tightened the wire around the gate post and kept his eyes on his hands. Finally, he said Anna's name had come up in a disagreement between the fathers, but he had not been told every detail. It was more than he had admitted before and less than I needed. I asked him what the disagreement was about. Daniel said he did not know, then corrected himself and said he did not know enough to explain it fairly. That small change mattered. He knew something, maybe not everything, but enough to choose his words carefully. I asked whether he would marry me if our fathers stopped speaking to each other tomorrow. For the first time, he looked directly at me. He said yes. Then I asked whether he would still marry me if doing so damaged whatever agreement existed between the farms. His face closed again. He told me there was no reason to create a problem before we even knew whether one existed. Until then, my goal had been simple: understand why the wedding kept moving. After that conversation, the question became harder. I needed to know whether Daniel wanted a marriage with me or whether our marriage was tied to something both families were afraid to lose. I did not think he was cruel. That almost made the uncertainty worse. Cruelty would have given me something clear to resist. Daniel was patient, useful, familiar, and frightened of conflict. I had loved those qualities when they made him gentle. Now I saw how the same qualities could make him cooperate with silence. A person does not have to plan a deception to benefit from keeping one undisturbed. The practical consequence came quickly. My mother stopped including me in some wedding preparations, saying there was no point making decisions while I was so unsettled. My father asked Daniel to visit less often until I became calmer. Nothing was forbidden outright. That would have been easier to name. Instead, ordinary parts of my life narrowed around me. I had fewer chances to speak with Daniel alone, less access to the ledger, and more reminders that my questions were exhausting everyone. Even my aunt told me I should be grateful the families were still willing to move forward. I remember thinking how strange it was that everyone described the wedding as something being offered to me. That evening, I returned to my notebook and added another line beneath the question about Anna and Daniel. Who loses something if I learn the answer? I did not yet know what the loss might be. Money, land, reputation, pride. Maybe nothing dramatic. But the fear around the subject was too organized to come from a romantic disappointment alone. My mother protected the ledger. My father protected the past. Daniel protected the peace. Each person seemed to be guarding a different edge of the same thing. 2 days later, my father told me both families would meet with a minister before the third wedding date was discussed. That was when I understood my private questions had become a family matter. Part 4. The news of the meeting seemed to travel faster than I expected. By the next afternoon, my aunt arrived with a basket of apples and asked whether I was feeling more settled. I had not told her there would be a minister present. When I asked how she knew anything was wrong, she said families talk when plans affect more than one household. That answer gave me my first sense that the problem was no longer private. People knew there had been delays. Some knew Anna's name had been connected to Daniel. I could not tell who knew the whole story, but I began to feel as if everyone stood around a table whose center had been covered from me. My mother became gentler then, which made me more uneasy than if she had argued. She brought tea to my room, offered to finish sewing I had neglected, and asked me not to let worry ruin what could still be a good marriage. I asked what I was supposed to stop worrying about. She said Daniel cared for me and that old family expectations did not have to control the present. It was the closest she had come to admitting that those expectations were real. I asked whether Anna had been hurt by them. My mother looked toward the doorway and said only that Anna had made a choice the rest of us had been forced to live with. That sentence angered me because it made Anna sound like the cause of everything. I took her letter from my sewing basket and read it again. Her question felt different. Had I chosen Daniel freely, and did I believe I could change my mind? There was no bitterness in the words, no claim on him, no demand that I stop the wedding. I began to wonder whether she had been trying to tell me something without putting it plainly on paper. I considered writing back, but I did not know what to ask. If I accused her, I might close the only door open. If I trusted her, I might learn something my parents had worked hard to keep quiet. My father noticed the letter on the table before I could put it away. He did not take it, but he asked when Anna had written. I told him. Then I asked why that mattered. His jaw tightened, and he said Anna had already caused enough confusion years ago. I asked what she had done. He replied that she had refused to honor what both families believed would happen. He stopped there, as if he had said too much. I asked whether the same expectation had simply been moved from Anna to me. He denied it, but he did not sound offended by the idea. He sounded tired. That difference stayed with me long after the conversation ended. The practical pressure increased as the meeting approached. My father began handling messages between our house and Daniel's, instead of letting Daniel speak with me directly. My mother kept the ledger in a locked desk drawer. Even trips into town became group errands rather than chances for me to think alone. Nobody called these restrictions. They were explained as ways to reduce gossip and keep the family calm. I still worked, ate, prayed, and slept under the same roof. But my choices felt smaller every day. The strangest part was that no one seemed to believe they were punishing me. They spoke as if protecting the wedding required protecting me from the questions I was asking about it. On Sunday, I heard 2 women behind me speaking before the service began. One said she hoped the girls would not be made to carry an old disagreement any longer. The other noticed me and stopped. I turned around, but neither woman would explain what she meant. That was the first time I knew Anna and I were being discussed together outside our family. I did not feel embarrassed the way my father had warned I would. I felt relieved. If other people recognized that something was wrong, then perhaps I had not imagined the pattern. but relief brought another fear with it. If outsiders knew enough to speak carefully, how long had the people closest to me known everything? That evening, Daniel came later with a message from his father about the meeting time. We stood near the porch while his horse shifted against the hitching rail. I asked him a question before he left. If the minister asked directly whether Anna had once been expected to marry him, would he answer plainly? Daniel was quiet for so long that I could hear the leather harness creak. Finally, he said he would tell the truth as he understood it. I asked what that meant. He said there were things our fathers had discussed before either of us was old enough to make decisions. Then he added that he did not want old plans to destroy what we had chosen. His use of the word chosen stayed with me all night. I wanted to believe our relationship belonged to us, but each fact suggested that other people had been arranging the edges of it long before I understood what those edges were. The next afternoon, both families gathered in a front room at a relative's house, away from neighbors. The minister arrived last. He greeted everyone, removed his coat, and sat in the chair nearest the window. I noticed that my father had brought no papers. Daniel's father had brought a narrow brown envelope. When I looked at it, he placed one hand over the flap. Before anyone prayed or spoke, I knew the meeting was not about calming me. Part 5. The minister began with a prayer, then asked my father to explain why the wedding had been delayed twice. My father spoke about misunderstanding, timing, and the need to preserve peace between neighboring families. Daniel's father added that old expectations had created confusion. Nobody used Anna's name. I listened until the words began circling each other, then asked whether this meeting was about my sister. The minister looked at both fathers before answering. He said he had heard enough to know Anna's name belonged somewhere in the history, but not enough to know why it still affected me. That was the first sentence all afternoon that sounded like a question instead of a defense. Daniel's father finally opened the brown envelope. Inside were several folded papers, none of which he handed to me. He said years earlier our families had discussed a future arrangement that would strengthen cooperation between the farms. He did not call it a contract. He did not call it a promise. He kept using the word understanding. I asked whether Anna had been part of that understanding. He said yes. The room changed after that. My mother stared at her hands. Daniel shifted in his chair. My father told me not to mistake an old family hope for an obligation. I asked why an old hope needed an envelope, 2 canceled weddings, and so much silence. The minister asked the same question in a quieter way. Daniel's father said the papers were mostly notes about shared work, land access, equipment, and plans our fathers had discussed over the years. Marriage had been mentioned alongside those plans because both families once believed Anna and Daniel might eventually marry. He insisted no legal marriage agreement existed and no one could force such a thing. I believed that part. What troubled me was everything surrounding it. If the paper had no power, why protect it? If Anna had refused, why had nobody simply crossed out her name? Daniel's father said some matters had been left unfinished because reopening them would have caused unnecessary embarrassment. Then the discussion turned toward me. My questions were described as understandable, but also dangerous if repeated carelessly outside the family. My father said rumors could make Daniel's family appear dishonest. Daniel's father said people might wrongly believe Anna had been promised against her will. The minister warned everyone against hiding facts merely to avoid gossip, but he also urged restraint until the full history was clear. I noticed how quickly my need for an answer had become a problem of reputation. Nobody accused me of lying. They simply spoke as though truth required permission before it could be said aloud. I asked what exactly they wanted from me before another wedding date could be considered. My father said he wanted me to trust that the past did not determine my marriage. Daniel's father wanted me to stop treating the old papers as evidence of wrongdoing. Daniel wanted us to move forward without letting decisions made years earlier define us. Each request sounded reasonable when separated from the others. Together, they required me to accept one thing: I was supposed to continue toward marriage without seeing the document everyone agreed had caused confusion. I said I could not do that. The minister did not order me to change my mind. Instead, he asked whether anyone in the room could explain why Anna's name still appeared in household records connected to my wedding dates. No one answered immediately. My mother finally said the ledger had been copied from older family notes when the first date was planned. I asked what older notes. She looked toward my father. He said some information had been carried forward because changing it would have required discussing matters they believed were finished. That explanation gave me more than he intended. Anna's name had not appeared by accident. It had survived because nobody wanted to acknowledge why it needed removing. The minister asked whether the written understanding was still somewhere in the family papers. Daniel's father placed his hand on the envelope again and said he believed the original page still existed, though he had not brought it with him. I felt anger then, but not the kind that makes a person shout. Mine became very still. 2 wedding dates had been canceled. My sister's initial had appeared beside mine, and I had been told repeatedly that nothing important remained from the past. Now everyone in the room agreed a page existed that none of them wanted me to see. I asked Daniel whether he had known about it. He said he knew there had been family discussions involving Anna, but he had never read the paper himself. The answer left a narrow space between ignorance and convenience. I could not tell which side he stood on. I only knew I was no longer willing to marry inside that uncertainty. The third date had not yet been set, but everyone had assumed it would follow this meeting. I changed that before we left. I said there would be no new date until I saw the original page and understood why Anna had been named in it. My father told me I was making a private family matter larger than it needed to be. I answered that it had already become larger the moment it began deciding my wedding. The minister said nothing, then told the fathers that clarity would be better than another postponement built on half-truths. Daniel's father folded the papers back into the envelope. He promised to look for the original. I no longer trusted promises without paper. Part 6. Anna arrived 4 days after the meeting, carrying a small cloth bag and wearing the expression she used when she expected an argument. My mother had written to her, though I did not know what the letter said. Anna greeted everyone politely, then asked if I could help her sort jars in the pantry before supper. We worked side by side among shelves of peaches, beans, and apple butter, while the kitchen noises stayed safely on the other side of the door. For several minutes, she said nothing about Daniel. Then she noticed the notebook tucked beneath my apron and asked, "Have they finally told you why the dates keep moving?" I told her about the envelope, the meeting, and the original page Daniel's father claimed still existed. Anna stopped wiping dust from a jar and set the cloth down. She did not look surprised. That frightened me more than surprise would have. I asked whether she had ever been promised to Daniel. She shook her head at the word promised and said that was not how anyone had described it to her. Years earlier, both fathers had spoken as though a future marriage between her and Daniel would naturally follow the friendship between the farms. At first, she had treated their comments as family talk. Then the comments became expectations, and the expectations became plans. Anna said Daniel had never formally asked to court her. Their parents simply kept placing them together and speaking about the future as though the important part had already been decided. She remembered being told how convenient the match would be, how smoothly land and equipment could continue to be shared, and how pleased both families would become. She had liked Daniel well enough, but liking someone was not the same as choosing a life with him. When she finally said she did not want the match, our father treated her refusal as a rejection of the whole family. Daniel's father stopped visiting for months. What I had heard called difficulty had been Anna choosing differently. I asked why she had never told me. Anna's face tightened, and for the first time I understood that my question was unfair. She said I had been 17 then, still living inside the version of the family story our parents preferred. She had tried explaining herself once, but I had repeated our mother's words back to her, that she was being stubborn and making everyone suffer. I remembered the conversation immediately. At the time, I had believed I was defending my parents. Anna had heard something else. She had heard her younger sister choose the family's explanation over hers. After that, she stopped trying to make me understand and eventually moved away. The shame of that memory made it difficult to look at her, but Anna did not use it against me. Instead, she asked when Daniel had first begun visiting me alone. I told her. She counted backward quietly and said it was almost a year after she refused the family plan. She had assumed the old expectation was finished by then. Nobody told her that our parents still discussed the farms together, and nobody asked whether she objected to my relationship with Daniel. "I did not give him to you," she said softly. "He was never mine to give." That sentence removed a rivalry I had been carrying without realizing anyone had placed it there. I took Anna's letter from my pocket and showed her the creases from reading it so often. I asked why she had written only 2 questions instead of telling me everything. She said she did not know how much I already knew, and she feared that a detailed letter might be shown to our father before reaching me. More than that, she did not want to tell me whom to marry. She wanted to know whether I believed I could choose. Her warning had not been about Daniel himself. It had been about the invisible pressure surrounding him. She had recognized the same language, peace, family, embarrassment, gratitude, that had been used when people tried to change her mind. Then Anna told me what her refusal had cost. For months, our father spoke to her only when work required it. Our mother remained kind, but repeatedly asked whether Anna understood what she had done to the relationship between the families. Invitations became awkward. Daniel's parents stopped including her in gatherings she had attended since childhood. None of it was called punishment. Everyone behaved politely enough to deny that anything deliberate was happening. Anna eventually accepted work with relatives, partly because distance was easier than living inside constant disappointment. Hearing this, I finally understood why she had asked whether I could change my mind. She knew that choice could exist on paper while becoming expensive in daily life. Before we left the pantry, I asked the question that had followed me since the minister's meeting. If Anna had refused years ago, why was her initial still beside my wedding dates? She stared at the shelves for a long moment, then said she had never seen my mother's ledger and had never agreed to replace herself with me in any family plan. As far as she knew, her name should have disappeared the day she refused. That answer cleared her of the thing I had secretly feared most. Anna had not interfered with my wedding. She had been removed from a plan without the plan itself being removed. Now we needed to know who had kept it alive. Part 7. The next morning, Anna asked whether Mother still kept the old family papers in the cedar box above the upstairs wardrobe. I had seen the box before, but never opened it. Mother used it for receipts, letters, and records too old for the kitchen ledger. We waited until our parents were outside, then carried it to my room and spread the contents across the bed. Most of it was ordinary: equipment notes, seed purchases, tax receipts, and letters between our fathers. Then Anna found a folded page with Daniel's family name written across the top. Her face changed before mine did. She recognized our father's handwriting immediately. The page was not a marriage contract, and nothing on it said Anna could be forced to marry anyone. That mattered. What it did contain was a list of future arrangements between the farms, shared equipment, access to a narrow field road, help during harvest, and several notes about how cooperation would become easier when the families were joined. Beside that line was Anna's name, followed by Daniel's. The writing was casual enough to look harmless until I understood what it assumed. Their marriage had been treated like one more practical item on a list, placed between work arrangements and land access as though 2 people could be scheduled beside machinery. Anna sat on the edge of my bed and read the page twice. She said she had never seen it. She remembered our father speaking about shared land and Daniel's father discussing equipment, but nobody had shown her that her name had been written into those plans. I asked whether she thought the page explained why our fathers had remained angry after her refusal. She nodded, then pointed to several later notes added in different ink. The cooperation between the farms had continued even after Anna moved away. Nothing beside her name had been crossed out. The practical arrangement survived her refusal, while the part involving her was simply left sitting there unresolved. That was when my own courtship began to look different. Daniel had started visiting me nearly a year after Anna left, and because I liked him, I had never questioned why both fathers welcomed the relationship so quickly. Now I wondered whether they had seen our affection as a solution. If Daniel married another daughter from the same household, the families could preserve the future they had imagined without admitting that the first version had failed. I did not believe my feelings for Daniel were invented, they were mine, but I could no longer ignore how useful those feelings had become to everyone who wanted the old arrangement to continue without explaining its history. We returned to the kitchen ledger and laid it beside the older page. The initials M and A no longer looked like a harmless planning note. Anna's initial had survived because the wedding information had been copied from records built around the first expectation. Mother had told me Anna once helped organize family events, but that explanation could not account for the older page. I began to understand why she had closed the ledger so quickly. Removing Anna's name would have required someone to admit why it was there. Instead, they had kept copying around the problem, hoping a new bride from the same family would make the old wording unimportant. Then the postponements finally formed a pattern. The first delay had come when questions arose about changing old family information without discussing Anna. The second followed the argument between our fathers over how much of that history needed to be acknowledged. The third had collapsed because I demanded to see the document itself. None of the delays had been caused by one dramatic secret. They came from repeated attempts to move forward without naming the original assumption. Each time the wedding approached, somebody had to decide whether to correct the record honestly or simply carry the old arrangement into a new date. Silence kept winning until I started asking for paper. My anger toward Anna disappeared so completely that I felt ashamed for ever treating her letter as jealousy. She had not been waiting to reclaim Daniel. She had been watching me step into the same machinery she had escaped, except my position was harder to see because I actually cared for him. That difference mattered. Anna had resisted a match she did not want. I was questioning a marriage I might still want, but only if it belonged to Daniel and me. I told her I no longer knew whether that was possible. She said the answer would depend on what Daniel did after learning I had seen the page, not on what our fathers claimed. We put the original page back exactly where we found it, but I copied every line into my notebook first. I was no longer searching for proof that Anna had once been considered for Daniel. I had that. The question now was whether the people around me would admit what the paper meant for my own engagement. If they treated it as irrelevant, they could keep the fourth date moving as though nothing had changed. If they acknowledged it, then Daniel and I would have to decide whether our relationship could stand apart from the arrangement that had helped bring us together. For the first time, the next wedding date felt less like a celebration than a test. Part 8. Daniel came the following evening, and I told him I had seen the original page. I did not show him my copy. I wanted to hear what he would say before he knew how much I possessed. He looked genuinely startled when I described the notes linking Anna's name to the farms, but not entirely surprised that such a page existed. He admitted his father had spoken years ago about how convenient a marriage between the families would be. He insisted he had never been shown the document and had never agreed to marry Anna. I believed part of that. What I no longer believed was that he had been as uninformed as he first claimed. I asked why he had not told me everything when I first questioned him. Daniel said he was afraid that old family arguments would poison something he considered real between us. He said his feelings for me had nothing to do with land, equipment, or our fathers. I wanted to accept that distinction because I still cared for him. But affection did not erase the fact that silence had made his life easier. As long as I knew less, he never had to confront his father, explain Anna, or risk the wedding. I told him ignorance and withholding were different things. He did not argue. For once, he simply said he understood why I no longer trusted his version completely. Canceling the wedding permanently sounded simple whenever I imagined it alone. In daily life, nothing was simple. I lived in my parents' house and worked within the rhythm of our family. My savings were small. Transportation depended on relatives, and nearly every practical part of my week involved someone connected to either household. Leaving would not mean walking out one door and becoming independent by supper. It would mean finding work, housing, rides, and a way to remain connected to people I loved while refusing the plan they believed protected us. Knowing I had a choice mattered. Knowing the cost of that choice mattered too. Anna understood that better than anyone. I began keeping my notebook beneath a loose board inside my clothes chest. The copied page went there too. I was not preparing for a courtroom or some dramatic public accusation. I simply wanted one version of events that could not change whenever another person became uncomfortable. My mother noticed I had stopped asking about the ledger, and I think she mistook that for acceptance. In truth, I had stopped needing access to it. I already had enough to know the story I had been given was incomplete. That small piece of control changed me. I still felt dependent in many ways, but I was no longer dependent on anyone else to remember what had been said. Anna offered something more practical. If I needed distance, she said I could stay for a while with the relatives who employed her. There was no promise of a new life waiting there, only a spare bed and work I might be able to learn. The offer frightened me because it turned escape from an idea into an actual possibility. I told her I was not ready to leave, and she did not push. She said having somewhere to go could matter even if I never went. That sentence gave me a kind of calm. For the first time, remaining at home felt like a decision I was making for the moment, not the only condition available to me. For several days, Daniel seemed to change with me. He confronted his father about the old page and told me he had asked that every reference to Anna be removed before another wedding date was discussed. He said if we married, it should begin with a new record and no hidden understanding between the farms. I wanted to believe this was the separation I had been waiting for. We spoke more openly than we had in months. He even admitted that his habit of avoiding conflict had protected him while leaving me to absorb the confusion. That admission mattered. I began to think our relationship might survive if we stopped treating the wedding as something that had to be rescued. Then Daniel asked me for one thing. He said his father was willing to correct the records, but continuing to discuss the old document would only humiliate both families. He wanted us to set a fourth date and stop asking relatives who had known what years ago. He called it a chance to begin cleanly. I asked whether beginning cleanly meant everyone acknowledging what had happened. He said it meant refusing to let the past control us. The words sounded reasonable, yet I heard the old pattern inside them. Again, peace required that I stop asking before every answer had been given. Again, the future was being offered on the condition that the past remain partly unnamed. That was the moment my hope changed shape. I still wanted Daniel to choose me, but I no longer wanted that choice if it required me to pretend the surrounding arrangement had never existed. I told him I would consider a fourth date only if the records were corrected openly, and neither family treated Anna and me as interchangeable pieces of the same plan. Daniel said he would speak to his father again. A week later, my mother announced that a new date had been approved and preparations could begin. Everyone behaved as though the matter was finished. I asked who had corrected the old information. My mother paused before answering. They told us it was taken care of. Part 9. The fourth date was set for a Thursday morning, and everyone treated its arrival like proof the trouble had ended. My mother baked before dawn. Relatives arrived carrying food, coats, and careful smiles. Daniel stood near the window, speaking with his father. I kept watching the folded paper because I had asked 3 times whether the old information had been corrected. Each time someone told me yes. After months of delays, suspicion had become exhausting. Still, when the minister picked up the paper, I noticed Daniel's father glance toward mine. It was the look men exchanged when something had not gone as planned. The minister began with Daniel's name, then he read Anna's. For 1 second, I thought I had heard incorrectly. I looked at my mother, expecting her to interrupt. She did not. My father stared at the floor. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if the sound confirmed something he feared. Anna, who had come because I asked, sat completely still beside the wall. The minister stopped and looked down at the page. "This says Anna," he said. Nobody answered. That silence told me more than the name itself. A simple mistake produces confusion. This produced recognition. The old record had survived every promise of correction. My father moved first. He said the name could be changed immediately, and there was no reason to upset everyone over a clerical error. My mother reached for my hand. Daniel's father said the paper must have been copied from an older record and apologized. Every explanation focused on how quickly the problem could be erased. Nobody answered the question underneath it. Why had the oldest version still been used after months of arguments? I asked who prepared the paper. Daniel's father said one family note had been copied forward. I asked which note. He looked toward the brown envelope beside his coat. Daniel came closer and asked me not to turn one wrong name into another canceled wedding. His words sounded like everything I had heard before. Keep the peace. Do not make the problem larger. Let the correction be enough. I asked whether he had personally checked the information after promising it would be fixed. He admitted he had not. He had trusted his father. I told him that was the problem. Everyone kept trusting the person above them while expecting me to carry the result. Daniel said he still wanted to marry me. I believed him. But wanting me had never been the only question. Then Anna stood. She did not raise her voice. She asked why her name was still being used in plans she had rejected years earlier. Daniel's father said nobody intended to include her and repeated that it was an old record. Anna answered that an old record does not copy itself. Someone chooses which page to use. The room became uncomfortable because she made the problem practical rather than emotional. Someone had preserved the original arrangement, relied on it again, and expected a correction to close the matter. Anna looked at me and said neither of us should be treated as a replacement for the other. My father asked me to think about what would happen if I stopped the wedding again. Relatives had traveled. Food had been prepared. People would talk. I understood every consequence because I would live with them too. But for the first time, those consequences did not sound larger than my own. I asked one final question. Would both fathers state in front of everyone that Anna's refusal ended the original expectation and that my marriage was not a continuation of it? My father hesitated. Daniel's father said such a statement would create unnecessary confusion. That hesitation answered me more clearly than any apology could have. I said I would not marry Daniel that day. My mother whispered my name, and someone near the doorway began crying, but I did not change my decision. I was not refusing Daniel forever. I was refusing to let a fourth date become another layer over the same hidden arrangement. Daniel asked whether anything he said could change my mind. I told him not there, not then. If our relationship was real, it could survive one honest pause better than a wedding built on silence. The minister folded the paper and set it down. The hardest pressure came from knowing I was disappointing people I still loved. The room slowly emptied without celebration. Anna stayed beside me while my mother cleared untouched cups from the table. My father went outside without speaking. Daniel stood in the yard with his coat over one arm, then left with his family. I watched the buggy disappear past the fence and felt grief, relief, and fear. 3 earlier dates had been postponed by other people. The fourth was the first one I stopped myself. That difference mattered more than I understood then. Once everyone was gone, I picked up the paper the minister had left behind. Anna's name was still there, and beneath it was a notation I had never seen. Part 10. The notation beneath Anna's name was a date from 6 years earlier, followed by my father's initials and Daniel's father's. I carried the paper to the window and compared the handwriting with the copy in my notebook. The marks matched the period when Anna had refused the expected match. Beside the date, 3 words had been added: retain family understanding. I asked Anna what she thought it meant. She shook her head. Neither of us wanted to invent an answer, but one thing was clear. Her name had not remained because someone forgot to erase it. Someone had deliberately preserved the old arrangement after knowing she had refused it. The next morning, my father finally agreed to explain. He said that after Anna refused, both families feared losing years of cooperation over fields, machinery, and seasonal work. Rather than tear up every old note, the fathers decided to leave the broader understanding in place while accepting that Anna herself would not marry Daniel. In their minds, the practical arrangement mattered more than the exact form it eventually took. When Daniel and I began courting, they saw a way for the families to remain connected without reopening an embarrassing dispute. Nobody sat me down and announced that I was replacing Anna. That was precisely how the substitution became possible. The first postponement, my father admitted, began when my mother noticed that wedding information copied from older family notes still contained Anna's initial. She asked whether it should be removed and whether I should be told why it was there. The fathers disagreed. Daniel's father wanted the record corrected quietly. Mine believed explaining it would only create suspicion about a plan that, in his view, no longer mattered. They postponed the date to avoid deciding in front of relatives. What I had been told was simply that Daniel's family needed more time. The sentence was not completely false. It was incomplete in the exact place that mattered to me. The second delay came after the same disagreement returned. By then, Daniel's father had accepted that Anna's name should disappear, but he did not want the old family understanding disgust beyond the two households. My father feared changing records without explaining them might look dishonest if anyone later asked questions. Instead of choosing honesty, they chose more time. The unresolved family business I had been given was their argument over how much truth was necessary. I remember feeling almost foolish when I heard that. I had imagined some enormous hidden event. The secret was smaller and, to me, worse. Adults repeatedly deciding that my knowledge of my own wedding could be managed. The third date failed for a different reason. By then, I had stopped cooperating with vague explanations and demanded to see the original page. My father admitted they hoped the document could be corrected or replaced before I ever read it. Daniel's father searched for the old papers, but no one wanted to be the person who handed me proof that Anna's name had once been tied to the family's future plans. The meeting with the minister forced them to acknowledge the page existed, but even then, they still treated seeing it as unnecessary. My refusal created the third postponement because, for the first time, the missing information mattered more to me than keeping the schedule. The fourth failure exposed what all that caution had preserved. Daniel's father had instructed a relative to prepare the announcement using the family records he believed were current. The relative selected the older page because it carried both fathers' initials and looked more official than the later notes. No one checked the bride's name before the paper reached the minister. Anna's name survived not because anyone planned to marry her that morning, but because the original assumption had never been clearly struck from the family record. Years of avoiding one uncomfortable correction had carried her name all the way into my fourth wedding date. Daniel came to see me 3 days later. This time, he did not claim ignorance. He admitted that before our first date was postponed, his father had told him there was an old complication involving Anna and the farms. Daniel had chosen not to ask for details because he feared learning something that might force him to challenge both families. He said he convinced himself that if he loved me, the history did not matter. I told him that was the part I could not excuse easily. He had not created the arrangement, but when silence protected our wedding, he accepted its benefits. He listened without defending himself, which was more honest than anything he had offered before. There was no grand reckoning afterward. My father never described himself as having deceived me, though he admitted he should have told me sooner. Daniel's father apologized for preserving records that should have been corrected, but he still believed the families had acted from practical concern rather than malice. Some relatives thought I had overreacted. Others quietly understood. Anna and I kept the copied page and the fourth announcement together in my notebook. When I looked at the household ledger again, the crossed-out dates no longer seemed like 4 separate failures. They were 4 attempts to avoid one sentence Anna had refused, I had never been told, and nobody had the right to treat us as interchangeable. Part 11. For several weeks after the fourth date, I stopped answering questions about whether Daniel and I would marry. People wanted a simple ending because simple endings make uncomfortable stories easier to carry. Some assumed I had left him. Others assumed I would forgive everything once emotions cooled. I did neither. I stayed with my parents for a time, worked beside my mother, and let the ordinary days return. Daniel did not visit unless I agreed beforehand. That small change mattered. For the first time, our relationship was not being advanced by fathers, calendars, or family expectations. Nothing moved unless I chose to move it, and I needed to learn what that felt like before making another promise. Anna and I repaired our relationship more slowly. We had years of misunderstandings between us, not just one letter and one wedding. I apologized for believing the family version of her refusal without ever asking what happened. She admitted she had judged me too, assuming I would always protect our parents rather than question them. We began visiting without Daniel's name being the reason. Sometimes we talked about the past, sometimes we spoke about work, food, weather, and people we both remembered from childhood. That ordinary closeness became more important to me than solving every old argument. I had lost a sister inside a story other people told about her, and I did not want to lose her again. Daniel waited longer than anyone expected. He did not arrive with another date or ask the minister to persuade me. He began, awkwardly, with questions he should have asked before. What did I want our marriage to look like? Where would decisions be made? And what would happen if our fathers disagreed with us? I did not reward those questions because they came late. Trust was not restored by one honest conversation, but I noticed that he had stopped speaking about what would be easiest for the families. He began speaking about what would be fair between us. Whether that change came from fear of losing me or from real understanding, I could not know. Time had to answer that. My parents changed too, though not in the dramatic way stories sometimes promise. My father never became comfortable discussing the old arrangement. He still believed he had been protecting family stability. My mother admitted more plainly that closing the ledger that day had been wrong. She said she had known enough to understand why the initial mattered and had hoped the problem would disappear before I asked again. That admission hurt, but it was useful because it was specific. We stopped arguing about whether anyone had meant harm. Intention was no longer the only measure I cared about. I wanted them to understand that withholding a choice can shape a life even when people doing it believe they are helping. Months later, I finally decided what I wanted from Daniel. I did not agree to another wedding immediately. I agreed to begin again without a date attached. We met because we chose to meet, not because preparations had started. I asked questions that once would have embarrassed me. He answered some easily and struggled with others. I watched what he did when his father disagreed with him because that told me more than promises made privately. I also kept the option of leaving open. That mattered. A choice means very little when only one answer is allowed. For the first time, staying with Daniel did not feel like obedience to an old plan. It felt like something I could reconsider. The household ledger eventually came back to me. My mother placed it on the table one winter afternoon and said I could keep it if I wanted. The page with the 4 dates was still there, 3 crossed out, the 4th marked with a note in my mother's hand. Beside the earlier entries, the initials M and A remained visible. I did not erase Anna's initial. I wanted the page to tell the truth about what had happened. Records can be corrected without pretending the first version never existed. That ledger stopped being evidence I needed against my family. It became a reminder that a crossed-out date can hide a decision, and a small initial can carry years of silence. I cannot tell every viewer what they should do when family loyalty and personal choice collide. Circumstances differ, and this story belongs to one fictional household, not to every Amish family or community. But I learned something that reaches beyond our setting. If an important decision affects your life, knowing the real reasons behind it is not disrespect. Asking who benefits, who already knew, and what has been left unsaid can be part of making an honest choice. If you have followed Miriam Amish home through this story, you can subscribe for more dramatized accounts about family, faith, and hidden expectations. And I would ask you one question. Would correcting the name alone have been enough for you? I remember that 4th date differently now. For years, I thought of it as the morning my sister's name was read where mine should have been. That was the humiliation everyone could see. The deeper meaning came later. Anna's name exposed a plan that had survived her refusal, my ignorance, 3 postponements, and every attempt to keep the peace without correcting the record. I do not remember the 4th date as the day my wedding failed. I remember it as the first date that belonged to me, because I was the one who decided what happened next. The ledger still carries both initials. This time I understand why. Neither one of us was ever meant to be the other's replacement.